But this has something to do with your recent paper delivered at the American Academy of Religion honoring Gustavo Gutierrez. And so this interview is to delve deeper into the significance of the summer session where you honor Gustavo Gutierrez on his 60th birthday. Okay, so the first question, I guess, is the summer session. So what are those summer sessions at Maryknoll?
Well, when I came to Maryknoll in 1980, very soon after I was asked to found and direct the Institute for Justice and Peace there. And I accepted, but I had never directed a program in that kind of way and didn't know what to do. So I asked around in terms of programs. It was going to be an MA program in Justice and Peace. And one of the sisters suggested a summer program, but I didn't know anything about that. And I said, well, why? Well, a lot of sisters were educators and they had the summers off and they went for more education. Mm-hmm. So in 1981, I had just been appointed. I developed this summer session. We advertised it in the National Catholic Reporter and got a tremendous response. And we also had in that fall, we started the first semester of the MA program in Justice and Peace.
1981.
1981.
Fall.
Mm-hmm. And then we had summer sessions all the way at least till 1989, and if memory serves me, 1990. So the summer session came about because it was suggested that we have that kind of program, and the response was so great that it became a mainstay of the Institute for Justice and Peace at the Maryknoll School of Theology. So each summer we had a different program, and I had to think up different programs at least a year in advance, because mm-hmm. you had to invite people, and especially if they were prominent people, they got booked up at the time. So each summer I directed the program, but also during that summer session was thinking and starting planning for the following summer.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember the first summer session you had?
I don't remember that much about it, except that nobody was prepared for the response. Mm-hmm. Maryknoll had a seminary, and I was asked to expand that into a school of theology through the MA in Justice and Peace, because mm-hmm. that wasn't for seminarians. Mm-hmm. And they really didn't have an infrastructure for something outside of Maryknoll. So every letter of interest that I received as director, I responded to myself. Mm-hmm. And the response, because Maryknoll at that time was becoming increasingly, it was always prominent in the Catholic community, but among progressive Catholics, it was the center of their view, because they had, through Orbis Books and through the people they brought to Maryknoll, created the links among liberation theologians around the world, published in English and all. And in the United States and elsewhere, Maryknoll was famous for liberation theology. So people who were interested in liberation theology as a way of, in a sense, saving their faith, because a lot of them were disillusioned with the church and disillusioned with parts of the Catholic being, in a sense, or a culture, were looking for something that was faith-based and justice-oriented, and our program mm-hmm. became that, and I think really during the 1980s was the best and most progressive Catholic theological program in the world. Mm-hmm. And the summer session, mm-hmm. that first summer session, I asked, where do you advertise? Well, I said National Catholic Reporter. Mm-hmm. You have to remember that I was new to the Catholic scene, even though I had just received my PhD from Marc H, a Jesuit university. Maryknoll was quite different than a university. And I didn't know the Catholic scene, so I asked and would take information and would piece things together. And that first summer session was just an eye-opener. And I also got the anti-Semitic mail. They didn't know I was Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
But that Maryknoll was moving more obviously to the left
Mm-hmm.
was something that Catholics loved, some Catholics and other Catholics.
So what was the anti-Semitic?
Well, you would get
mail?
these terrible screeds against Jews. Now, again, it wasn't because they knew I was Jewish. Nobody
Mhm.
knew who I was.
Mm-hmm.
But Maryknoll attracted tremendous loyalty and detractors because there were, on the right, they saw Maryknoll as basically communist, which was ridiculous. Inside Maryknoll was quite middle of the road, even conservative, but the elite of Maryknoll pioneered a new way for Americans and also other people around the world to do theology. So Maryknoll was a very mixed bag inside of Maryknoll. But the perception of Maryknoll, now this is after the sisters were killed and murdered, and liberation theology was a huge political issue in the United States that Maryknoll was centered on. You know, we talk about political theology. Maryknoll was doing political theology and was getting the applause and the hits for that. It was a huge issue, especially after the sisters were murdered. Went right to the U.S. Congress and into the White House. So this was Maryknoll was highly political as seen from outside, and inside was political and wasn't political.
So what was the original intention of the summer session? It was really for the updating of the sisters.
Well, it was to expand the school and to serve others who were interested in justice and peace issues. And of course, I had to develop a curriculum, a Catholic curriculum in justice and peace. Now, how do you do that? So I would sit and think and talk with people, and I said, well, how about a course on biblical perspectives on justice and peace? Okay, so we did that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a unit at Maryknoll with two other lay people. One of them, actually both of them Protestant, who were doing social analysis. And I asked them about it, and we formed a course on social analysis through the Peter Henry-O Joe Holland Reader, which I also picked up. And I remember when I asked one of the guys who worked there if he'd like to do a course, he sent around to leading seminaries in the country, asking them if they had a course to see if he could get information on how to do it. And he sent a letter to Harvard Divinity, and Harvey Cox wrote back, only Maryknoll would do something like that. We have nothing like that at Harvard.
Wow.
So we were on the cutting edge,
Mm-hmm.
but the cutting edge had to be developed. Maryknoll's witness was there, but Maryknoll itself couldn't develop that program. The genius of Maryknoll at that time was to bring in people to do things that they were known for, but they couldn't do themselves. And of course we had Orbis Books there, which I also did work with, which was the publishing arm of Maryknoll, which was the publishing arm of liberation theology around the world. So it was a fascinating environment, but the program, they asked me to start it. I said I would do it. I had no idea how to do it. I didn't have a plan. I cobbled together. It's sort of like Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. When I wrote the book, I didn't know what to write or how to write it. I cobbled it together. So there wasn't a great plan, but it would emphasize justice. And when they asked me for a title for the program, I said Faith and Justice. And they informed me that the papal encyclicals talked about justice and peace. So even the name, I had to think, okay, well, what does that mean in the encyclicals? I had to look and read. As a Jew, I was a learner. But the fact that they entrusted me with such a program, a young Jewish PhD, Of course, I had worked at the Catholic Worker and published on the Catholic Worker, so they knew I was interested in justice, and they had faith in me. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't a great plan, but once the summer session was so successful, and then we had students for the fall who would live at Maryknoll and study in the MA program, and it just took off from there.
Who were the people involved in for example, who were the leadership at Maryknoll at the time that this was?
Well, Jim Noonan was the superior general, and of course he had worked in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. And I have a deep affection for Father Noonan because he was a very humble man. And when I went into his office to chat with him, he would always bring out a big yellow legal pad and take notes on what I was saying. So, he was of course much older than I was, and I was very young, in my late 20s. So again, they showed a tremendous respect. So it was basically working with him, and then with the seminary professors, many of whom were not really liberation oriented at all. So I had to deal with a faculty that was already there for the seminary, including a contingent of Capuchins. But then bring people in like Otto Maduro, whom I met when Maryknoll, to give me the information I need, started sending me to their mission sites around the world. And in 1981, I was sent to Latin America, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Nicaragua, to learn on the ground what was going on. So I was getting educated. And also picking up people, and then through the Maryknoll Sisters I would find this person or that person who could lead a workshop like on South Africa, issues in Peru, places I had been some or had never been, and issues I didn't know anything about. So the environment of Maryknoll, first of all Maryknoll's name and its witness, and then the environment itself, helped me cobble this together, and when Otto came on board from Venezuela, we became a team.
This is what year did?
I think, if I remember correctly, Otto came in 1981 or 82. I met him in 1981 in Venezuela. And that's the other thing that's so interesting. These Latin American liberation theologians who I interact with first were just enthusiastic that Maryknoll would hire a Jew to run a program and to teach in their school of theology. And I remember meeting Otto. He had a big beard and these glasses. He looked like a Marxist, and he was Marxist, but also a Catholic. And I developed a close friendship with him. And of course, he helped me because he had so many connections. And that's how it started. There wasn't any great plan, and nothing was in place, and everything fell in place. It was like the window. Maryknoll's golden decade was the 1980s, and I happened to be there, and they happened to trust me and a few others to bring their witness to another level, their witness, which they couldn't do by themselves. That was their genius.
What level? But you say another level.
Well, because Maryknoll lived a certain life, but couldn't necessarily articulate that life because they were older, then older in their 50s or whatever. They had been trained and formed in a certain era as traditional missionaries, but gone through Vatican II. But they began to witness and to understand more deeply mission. In fact, they didn't like to be called missionaries. They were missioners. And they were in contact with the poor. And when Latin American Liberation Theology started, they were on the ground. They weren't the initiators. But some of them heard it and said yes. And they began to cultivate it and also fund parts of it, and through Orbis Books publish it. So, but Maryknoll itself, in general, couldn't articulate the vision that they were living. They needed outsiders, and the outsiders didn't change their witness. They made it more articulate. Mm-hmm. And I was one of them, and maybe a main one in certainly in the School of Theology.
Yeah, but that would have, as you said, there were progressive and traditional Maryknoll members of the community. That would have, did that alienate the others who are not into liberation, who are not liberationist oriented?
Oh, sure. The whole thing was controversial within Maryknoll, and I was controversial because what's a Jew doing at Maryknoll?
Yeah.
So I was the liberation theologians, when they met me, thought it was fantastic. Mm-hmm. Only Maryknoll could do that. Mm-hmm. But there were Maryknollers who thought, what's a Jew doing? And some on the faculty of the School of Theology, they thought, who is this young kid and he's Jewish? Not anti-Semitic, but just like, hey, we're Catholic. But the dean who hired me.
So those who are in the position are.
Well, in these orders, it's interesting. I found out in Catholic life, you have the people who have the vision, and you have the people who trust authority, and you have the people who are naysayers. Mm-hmm. So many of the people, there was an older priest, Father Bob Sheridan. He used to refer to me and introduce me as the young Dr. Marc Ellis. Now, he was not a liberationist, but he was tasked to be a liaison with ex-Maryknollers to keep them coming and feeling a part of the community. Now, he was not a liberationist, but he took on that job and did it well. He was a follower rather than an initiator. But you had a whole group of Maryknollers who trusted their leadership. And then there were those who would write the Vatican complaining about what Maryknoll was doing. So you had, I would say, 10% of the Maryknollers were liberationists. Maybe 40 or 50% would do what they were told to do because they thought it was good. They didn't quite understand it and may not agree with it. Yeah. And then you had, 10% who were perpetually dissatisfied, and 2% who would be writing the Vatican about Maryknoll going to hell, and so you had everything. And I was inside the Maryknoll world, so I saw over time all of it.
Okay, so let's go to the 1988 summer session. So when that session came, there has already been several summer sessions, and you have speakers that would give lectures during the summer sessions. Who were some of the speakers that you have?
Well, we had courses and workshops.
Okay.
I think it was 1983. Rosemary Ruether was the first famous person to give a workshop or a course. I can't remember now, but I remember somebody suggesting I invite her, and I thought, well, she doesn't know who I am. I mean, she's not going to come here. And she wrote back right away. She had read my Year at the Catholic Worker, loved the book, and was very interested in coming to Maryknoll, and she did. So we had people like Rosemary Ruether and James Cone, whom I had heard before many years ago, and I'd heard Rosemary too in the 1970s, but he responded right away. And James Cone came several times and taught courses and over the summer.
Why do you think these famous people would be interested in Maryknoll's program?
Well, everyone was interested in Maryknoll. Maryknoll was huge. Daniel Barrigan, whom I also had met, but he didn't remember meeting me. When I contacted him, he would come up all the time and teach courses and do workshops.
So being identified with Maryknoll is...
Being identified, they didn't know me. Well, Rosemary knew me. Maybe James Cone had heard of me a little bit, but they didn't come for me. They came because it was the most progressive Catholic program, theologically in the United States, I believe probably in the world. We had feminism from the beginning, and we had known people. Now when I started it, I didn't know that known people would come. I didn't know what we would do. But of course Orbis published a lot of, they knew about Orbis too, and a number of them had published books with Orbis or wanted to. So when you contacted them, it wasn't like they'd never heard of Maryknoll or Orbis. And they were very attracted to Maryknoll's witness. They identified with that witness. So there was actually no problem. When I started, I didn't know why somebody really well known would come to a small school of theology. But after a while, I just invited anyone that was on my mind, and if they weren't booked, they wanted to come. They loved Maryknoll.
And who else did you invite, or were there? And who else did you invite, but was not booked, but would love to come?
Well, once we got into the swing of things, especially in the summer, you had various liberation theologians, then of course finally Gustavo, Albert Nolan. I can't remember all of them now, but with the summer session, as you can see from the book, the '88 summer session, you had people from all over the world who wrote lengthy.
And these are really the people, the who's who.
Pablo Richard, of course Otto Maduro, who was already there, and we had many women as well, and so there was no problem. I mean, I didn't always know all the people, of course, and I didn't know everyone to invite, but once you got Cohn and Berrigan and Rosemary Ruether, who in 1989 we had a celebration of her life and work. We had Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza come to my center. I can't remember anybody that I invited who said no, except if they were already booked for years in advance, which some of them were. But there was no problem. Maryknoll was prestigious on the left for its witness, and people wanted to be involved. And the students, of course, were coming from all over the world too. So the environment of teaching in that kind of school of theology, where you had some young people who were really intellectuals, and you had people serving around the world who wanted to deepen their own commitment. That combination of the intellectual and the practical experience was tremendous, and it was.
This would require a huge amount of money.
No, it did not, actually,
really?
Because I was very. Maryknoll funded it. And of course we had in-house funding, which you didn't have to pay for. They had a big place, and we had rooms and all of that, so that didn't need to be paid for. But if I remember correctly, my budget for the summer was maybe $20,000 or $30,000, and we would get tuition too. So we were asked if we could to break even, and my recollection is we basically broke even. So it was not hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we paid fairly though. We paid a fair wage to the people who came to speak. But it was not expensive.
So if Rosemary would be invited by Princeton, it would be the same. You would pay her the same way that Princeton would pay her?
Well, I don't know what Princeton was paying, and I don't know if they invited Rosemary. But Rosemary wouldn't have cared. She would prefer. Well, she would like Princeton because she would have a way to speak her truth to this elite group. But if you asked her which she enjoyed more, I think she would say Maryknoll. But if I remember correctly, for a 2-day workshop for someone like Cohn, we paid $1,200. This is back in the 1980s. So I think it was. We paid a fair wage for that time. But they didn't come because of the money. And when he taught a course, I believe, if I remember correctly, and that would be once or twice a week we paid $2,000 or something like that. So it wasn't a fortune, but we weren't asking them to do something for free.
Yeah.
And that was one of the, and we had in-house labor and everything, so if it was done on its own, it would cost more, but my recollection is it was $20,000 to $30,000 a summer, and we got a lot of that back, if not all, from tuition.
Okay. All right. So let's go to the 1988 session. How did that come about?
Well, each summer, as the summer program was happening, and I was directing, I had to think about the next summer and start contacting people for the following summer. So I was always searching for ideas, and workshops especially, whether it's South Africa or Ethiopia or Peru or Latin, nonviolence and all of that. And I don't remember why, Gustavo Gutierrez, I had met him several times, enjoyed his presence, and of course he was famous, and I got this idea. I said to somebody, how old is Gustavo Gutierrez? And they said, well, I think he's going to be 60 in 1988. I said, well. And I was very aware of Medellin because I had become aware of Medellin and the document there and had taught it. And I remembered that Medellin, that would be the 20th anniversary. So
it was 1978, right?
Yeah, so 1968.
1968.
20th anniversary. So I thought, so I just chatted with some people and I said, what do you think about celebrating Gustavo's life and work? It's going to be 60. And Medellin's going to be 20. And they thought it was a great idea. So I contacted Gustavo and it was a go. That's really how I had no idea what it would become. I just thought it was a very good idea. And I went to Orbis and I said, well, I never really liked the cover of his book that Orbis did. Well, it was probably the appropriate cover, but I said, well, don't we need a new edition? And they said, well, that would be great. So the book that you see now, Gustavo's magnum opus, comes from that summer session. And of course, Gustavo also changed some of the theology of liberation because of the conservative backlash that he was feeling. So there's a lot involved there too. But I just it just came to me. He was turning 60, Medellin was 20. I thought, that's a good idea. Let's do that if Gustavo will do it. And he was very interested in doing it. And that's how the idea came. I'd like to take credit for the planning of a spectacular session that I knew would be worldwide, but I didn't really have an idea that it would be. And I had no idea how controversial it would be, including in Rome.
Yeah. So how controversial did it come to be?
Well, very, because at that time John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger were on liberation theology big time. And they were hunting down Boff, and unbeknownst to me, they were hunting Gustavo. And my own sense was that from hearing others that they were getting very close to censoring Gustavo like they would with Boff. In fact, one of my Catholic friends, a monk, a former monk, said to me, Mark, have you talked to the Superior General about this program you're developing? It'll be quite controversial, and do you have his approval? And I remember saying, oh.
So continuing with the story about the 1988 summer session that honored Father Gustavo Gutierrez. I mean, looking back at it, what do you think was the significance of that 1988 summer session?
Well,
the significance in Maryknoll and also with the wider Catholic
Well, liberation theology at that time was both on the move, insurgent, a political force that was now known, especially through the killing of the sisters. It was known before, but that highlighted Romero before then. So Maryknoll was in the public eye and in the Catholic eye. And the significance for people who wanted liberation theology and wanted to come was this was a hope, their Catholic hope. Not only Catholics, but primarily Catholics at Maryknoll, that the church would become something it hadn't been, and therefore would be that for them. I mean, many of the people who came to my program, including sisters and priests, were hanging on by their fingernails to stay within the Catholic fold. So Maryknoll was actually a sort of a saving element for a huge number of Catholics and others in terms of their own faith. So that was big. It wasn't just like, this is a good program, I'll get a degree or I'll get a certificate. This was, there was a lot at stake, and a lot of these people were working in dangerous areas of the world, and their lives were on the line. So when they came to a program like this, everything was at stake. And I remember teaching at Maryknoll, I was very young, and they would hang on every word that I spoke. And these were people who were working in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala and South Africa, all over the world. This was not just the typical classroom. These people were in harm's way, so that was one. Because of the sisters being killed, and there was a lot in Congress, the U.S. Congress and Senate and the presidency, this was a big deal. A lot of controversy there, but Maryknoll was central, especially to some of the Catholic members, like Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House. I mean, this was personal. They had a devotion to Maryknoll. So it was big politically, huge politically. It's difficult with the Contras and all of that. And for those who were against it, similar, big deal. What's happening to our Catholic faith is becoming communist. And Maryknoll was right at the cutting edge of this. They were not communist by any means. And they were, some of them were liberal, and some of them were totally middle of the road, and some of them were fairly conservative. And in fact, 60 Minutes wanted to do an interview with Gustavo Gutierrez. So think about that. And the interesting, the reason they didn't, his accent. Yeah, silly, but they didn't think it could communicate to but the interest. And I remember when I met President Carter in 1988 before the summer session. That's a whole nother story. When he asked me who I was, I said, I'm Jewish and I teach at Maryknoll. And he knew both of them, Jewish and Maryknoll. So when you have a former president, very, of course, involved in human rights and his presidency and all, so it was, then in Rome, it was very controversial, and the Superior General was called to Rome, and how he handled it was very interesting. The head honcho of missions took out a copy of the National Catholic Reporter advertisement that we had, which was a half or a full page, and said, what is going on here? These are the people that we want to be quieted. These are communists. And the head of Maryknoll took out his glasses and said, may I see what you have there? And he pretended he didn't even know about it. Well, he said, well, yeah, this is happening. The cardinal, I assume, said, is this really happening? But here's the deal, which is very interesting about Maryknoll and the Catholic Church. I was told when I was planning it by a Catholic monk friend, had I asked the Superior General, had I told him about this program, because he knew how controversial it would be, I did not. And I said, well, I never ask, and they don't ask me to ask them about programs. Why this? He said, you need to ask him, Mark. This is a big deal. So in the lunch line at Maryknoll, I ran into the Superior General and Bill Boatler, and I said, Bill, I've been told that maybe I should run this by you, this program, because it might be controversial. He said, well, what is it, Mark? I said, well, we're honoring Gustavo Gutierrez. And he said, well, I heard about that. What's the problem? I said, well, I think you need to know what we're doing because of my... He said, Mark, you've done an excellent job always. Just keep doing what you're doing. In other words, he was giving me permission to do. He didn't want to know. He didn't need to know. He was on board. So a lot of, from 60 Minutes being interested to the top political leaders in the United States, both pro and con being interested in liberation theology, for it and against it. Maryknoll being the center in the United States in their view of liberation theology. And of course, around the world, you had church leaders who wanted to sign on to it, and church leaders in almost in defiance of the Vatican, and church leaders who wanted the support of the Vatican who wouldn't. And Gustavo, during the planning sessions, would arrive in my office. He'd come up from Peru and ask me how things were going. I'd invite him into my office, and we would chat about who had said yes in terms of the theologians we were bringing, who had said yes in terms of the bishops and the cardinals, who had said no. He was a political, Gustavo was a church politics player, and he knew what was on the line much more than I knew. And he knew he was being observed and hounded. And what's beautiful about Gustavo, many things, is he was so humble. I was so young. And so out of his realm in so many ways, his Catholic realm. But he never tried to pull his status on me or tell me what to do or tell me not. He always was asking me questions. He led me on in different ways, but in a very humble way. So...
he never put pressure on you that
never,
this.
He never. He was always very curious about what was going on, because he knew in terms of church politics who signed on. Maybe even somebody who was somewhat conservative, that would be a big deal, and who said no, that could be a big deal. So, no, he never advised me. I asked him many questions, and he would tell me what he was thinking. Yeah. But he never probed in a way that that showed me that he was in control. He never tried to assert control.
So the leading theologians that attended the honoring of Gustavo Gutierrez, and they are really the leading theologians of this time. Sergio Torres, Johann Baptist Metz, Rosemary Ruether, Edward Schillebeeck, Dorothy Soleil, Arthur McGovern, Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, Carter Hayward. So how did they get? Did you invite each one of them? What was your role in inviting each of these theologians that attended the?
Well, Otto and I did it. I was the director, and Otto worked in my program, and Otto often wrote to people in Spanish, and he had connections, and I knew some people or knew of them, and we just wrote and asked. And then some people would ask us if they hadn't been contacted, if they could be part of it. So I don't remember all the details, but everybody who was asked, in my memory, in terms of writing, wrote. And they wrote on time. This was a big deal. This wasn't like it took 4 years to get all the essays and you had to keep getting back to them. No, they wanted to be part of it because for them it was part of their own faith. And we had people from around the world who came, and people from around the world who wrote. And they were very pleased to be part of this as part of their witness and to celebrate Gustavo's life and work.
How many days was the occasion?
Well, the summer session usually started either before or after July 4th. and ran into the first week of August. So it's basically a month.
And all of this, I mean, there are so many of them.
Not everybody was there physically, but a lot were. And it was just a gathering, in the United States at least, the biggest gathering of liberation theologians at that time ever. And as far as I know, this is the first Festschrift in honor of Gustavo. And if you look at the book, it's almost 500 pages, but the print is very small. There are over 50 essays. Probably today, if you printed it in a reader-friendly, it would be 700, 800 pages.
Yeah, that's very small.
Yeah, and you have a snapshot of liberation theologies around the world at that time.
Were there attempts to shut this down? Because you have the gathering of the probably the most radical theologians at that time.
Yes.
Were there attempts to shut it down or to? Now we're talking about Zoom bombing.
Yes, right.
Was there an attempt?
Not that if there was, Maryknoll was very good about protecting me and maybe others from dissonance in the background. Whether they were ever contacted about it, I don't know, because I was never told. Any conflict never came my way. I became aware, and of course James Cone was there, that's a whole other story too, about the internal workings at the conference between different liberation theologians and Black liberation theology and Latin American liberation theology. But if there was, and here's another thing about the Catholic Church, Cardinal O'Connor, who was considered a conservative, was a protector of Maryknoll because Maryknoll was within his bailiwick. So he certainly would have heard about it from the Vatican. What they said, I don't know. And maybe Maryknoll heard about it other than the Maryknoll Superior was called to Rome. That's a big, when you're called to Rome, you get down on your knees. But Maryknoll had its own power and its own standing, and within the Catholic Church, its own protection. So all the background never came my way. I do not remember ever hearing from a Maryknoll authority, Mark, be careful. Please don't do this. I did not. It's not that I don't remember. I did not get any of that.
You mentioned about the rivalry, the internal workings happening during the summer session. Of course, you invited. This is basically a gathering of all the leading international theologians. So it's really have a global perspective of liberation theology, which I think this is one of its significant contribution in doing theology globally. So can you tell more about that? What you mentioned as internal workings happening among liberation theologians, especially between Black liberation theology and Latin American liberation theology.
I had known James Cone, or interacted with him, starting in the 1970s when he came to speak at my university when I was an undergraduate. Of course, he didn't know who I was. And then met him in New Orleans when I was working at Hope House among the poor Black women mostly. And then at Maryknoll, I had invited him up several times to give workshops and to teach a course. So I had interacted quite a bit with Cone, especially in the 80s. But I missed the point, I think, with Cone when I organized this international gathering and didn't emphasize Black theology of liberation. I was in the Maryknoll world, which was international. Of course, Black theology of liberation had gone international, but I wasn't thinking that way. And I think it's fair to say that he was rather upset that a Black liberation theology wasn't highlighted at the conference. We didn't downplay it, but it certainly wasn't central. And around the fringes, not directly, but I saw a conflict between Cone and the Latin American liberation theologians, which the Latin American liberation theologians didn't want. They were quite humble about it. and were willing to cede the stage to Cone for a time and wanted to reconcile, because there had been issues before that I hadn't been aware of and I don't know the details of. But James Cone was very, shall we say, interested in keeping black theology of liberation central, and I understand that. So it was quite interesting for me, again as a white Jew directing the whole program, to be in the middle of something that I didn't understand fully, but I had created a platform for this interaction. And Cone was also under the gun, because Cone had developed a black theology of liberation, very particular, extremely particular, and he was being hit by others who were saying, well, we're part of this too, and you have to expand your view in terms of class struggle, in terms of women. In the end, Cone surrendered and opened himself to others, and of course his theology essentially then was over. I mean, its influence kept on, but he was only able to write through this deep and abiding particularity. So Cone was already by 1988 well established, famous, but no longer producing creative, original liberation theology, even from a black perspective. His run was over, and he was being confronted by others who said, open it up, which he eventually did. But then he became a sage rather than an insurgent.
Yes, so right now, because is there any connection between the two now with what's going on?
Well, I've always thought, in a sense, although I missed the boat a little bit on the celebration with Cone, I did think with Cone that once it was opened up, black liberation would take a back seat, that blacks would be left behind. I actually agree with Cone in some ways in his particularity, and thought then and thought today that once you opened it up, which you might have had to open it up, blacks would be a part but wouldn't be the center. And when blacks weren't the center anymore, they were going to be left behind. So when I hear African American theologians today, you can't hear James Cone in his original voice. And I miss that. They have to speak for themselves and why they do it and what they feel about it. But the thrust of it that Cone had, this tremendous power, this relentless energy, holding others' feet to the fire, is gone.
Now, with all this discussion about race, about critical theories, about all of these issues on race, is that a comeback for black liberation theology?
I don't think so. I think once Cone left that scene or that particularity, and once African Americans leave that particularity, their case is diminished. Doesn't mean it isn't real. I also believe that about Jewish. When certain groups open up, it's over. So we've had a resurgence of Black Lives Matter, and of course, but that's already fading. And it's not that it's not there, and it's not that it's unimportant. It's very important. But in my view, in America, African American is central to American history. And when that isn't seen as central by black liberation theologians, their case is diminished, not because it isn't real, but because there are too many others who want to occupy that space. There are only so many spaces available in argumentation. Mm-hmm. Now you can ask yourself the question about whether the argumentation that Cone had in its original form what I call the real James Cone, who would embrace me but wouldn't talk to me, basically, sort of like Mary Daly, who wouldn't embrace me but also wouldn't talk to me. You have to keep the pedal to the metal, or else you're going to be one among others. When blacks are one among others, since in America they aren't, if they are theologically, you lose its force. And I think that's simply, certainly when I hear African American theologians today, who may be terrific, I don't hear Cone's power. Maybe that's just impossible today under the circumstances, but to me it's sad to see that. I don't believe in America African Americans are one among others.
But perhaps the emphasis now is really, diversity. So African American Black liberation theology would be just one of the theologies.
Yes, well, that's certainly true.
Yeah.
But you ask yourself where that goes. Anyway, that's my view. Others certainly have their views, and I think for African Americans it became impossible to argue their case as the particularity. So it's impossible. But the force that Cone had, what I call the real James Cone, is missed. And maybe that was just a time period where it could happen through him, with all the limitations he had. And it can't happen now. And so African American liberation theologians with others have to find their own way.
Okay. Thank you for that very in-depth discussion on Black liberation theology. Let's go back to the summer session, and of course the title of the book was The Future of Liberation Theology. And I would like to ask, 50 years later, what is the future of liberation theology? And I would just like to read a part of that dreaming about the future of liberation theology. This one is from Pablo Richard, and this is just the last essay in that compilation. And he said 4 things about the future of liberation theology. One is that the future lies in its spirituality, its roots in the cultural and religious life of the poor, its commitment to liberation in Latin America. The second is for its immediate and also the distant future, liberation theology will be above all a biblical theology of liberation. The third is the future and power of liberation theology lie in its capacity for dialogue with third world theologies, especially with African and Asian theologies, and with the great third world non-Christian religions. Interesting they didn't mention Black liberation theology, which I think affirms your observation. And then the last one is it must affirm its future as a professional theology in dialogue with all the disciplines of liberation. That's Pablo Richard's view. What do you say about it?
First of all, Pablo Richard was a lovely, recently died, lovely man, very gentle, and I had a number of encounters with him, including in Costa Rica, where they published Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation in Spanish, and I went down there to launch the book, which was quite interesting for me. Again, we have this professionalization of theology. What does that mean for all of these theologies? In a sense, it anchors those theologies in the canon, but it also diminishes them. And maybe that's like with James Cone, maybe that's inevitable. And you then ask, well, what's happened to the people who liberation theology and theologies are speaking for? And the more professional it becomes, which may be of necessity, the less they speak for others. Now, we could also ask how much they spoke for others even in the beginning, because it was a professional theology already in a sense, especially in Latin America. It was conducted mostly by priests who were in their own elite status of education and relative affluence. And they were the ones who could write and who could make connections and who could speak. So liberation theology, it's said to come from the poor, but it's much more complex than that. So we have levels of speaking for others, and then there are others that aren't being spoken for at all, and then they try to find their place. And then there are still others who are outside of theological consideration. They're way outside. So everyone's looking for their place in the sun. When it becomes professional, it becomes a place of status and advancement, like at the American Academy of Religion. Even this year, the panels, you could see some very good thought and subversive thought, but these are all professors who are doing their resumes, looking for advancement, often to speak more for others in their view, but they're also achieving themselves. So complicated all around in terms of liberation theology. But I remember once, while I was at Maryknoll, returning a call, somebody was asking me to speak. And on the other line, it was the program for basic Christian communities. It was already within a church office in the United States. So when things become professionalized and institutionalized, you might say, well, we have a leg in, we have a place. But that place also means you have to conform to budgets, to certain institutional guidelines. Mm-hmm. You can speak about this and that far and not further. So there's a constraint that comes in. Now, Gustavo always made it clear, and in fact at the 88 summer session made it clear, that he didn't care whether it was called liberation theology, and theologies come and go in church history, of course, and now we have coloniality and decolonial, and that's become professionalized too, and it's a point of status and advancement for those who write about it. It doesn't mean that they aren't writing for others in their own view, but it becomes a muddle. It's we don't, in the end, you don't know what's going on and who's speaking for who and why. So now liberation theology, this is not to say that liberation theology is dead. That's a conservative view, and that's not my point, because where there are poor and struggling peoples, there are always going to be theologies, and we can call them what they want, including liberation theology, or we don't have to call them that. So
it's not dead, but it's no longer insurgent.
Well, it may be insurgent in certain places, but it certainly isn't insurgent the way I encountered it at Maryknoll in 1980 and into the 80s, and in 1988. It was already on its back leg in 1988. The church was hunting liberation theologians down, including Gustavo. And I would say the 1988 summer session was, in a sense, part of the pinnacle of liberation theology and part of its end. Not that it has ended, but what is original come out about liberation theology since then. We have additions. It's like a Jewish theology of liberation. We have many additions, and some of them are very, very important. But the framework of a Jewish theology of liberation or Latin American liberation theology, whatever you call it, remains central. And without that center, you have a scattering. And that's the danger of professionalizing these theologies. The center, the thrust, drops out. Then what do you have? You may have some very interesting fragments of thought, and they can be good. But then they're absorbed into other thoughts and other theologies. And so the central, when you heard Cone in the 1970s, whether he was right or wrong, the Black Christ, if Christ doesn't save blacks, forget him. I mean, this stuff was revolutionary and very disturbing, and it couldn't be carried on. But that thrust of that theology was unmistaken, and you can't have that now, which means, I think, in general, we're adrift. If you look at the American Academy of Religion or other societies and you attend these webinars, you wonder what the center is, if there is a center, and if we're not just drifting out to sea, where people are basically filling their resumes, also wanting something different, but often afraid that they may be let go, they may step over the line. And today, most of what is out there is within the, what Chomsky called the parameters of thinkable thought. On the one hand, he said that was sort of conservative and liberal, but it also can apply to liberation theology and those who work within that, even if under different labels.
Mm-hmm. It's now because I'm Asian, I'm also thinking about liberation, Latin American theology and Black theology are all very forceful theologies. Why is it the Asian? I was just thinking, what do you think? Why is Asian theology?
Well, when I traveled with Maryknoll around the world, of course I started in Latin America, then I went to Africa and to Asia, parts of Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And what Maryknoll missioners emphasized, sometimes too much, was that Latin American liberation theology was political, African liberation theology was spiritual, and Asian liberation theology was cultural.
Yeah.
Now, of course, these were the missioners' sense of the distinctions within Maryknoll of how to communicate between these sections of Maryknoll, which was not simple either. And of course, there are political dimensions and cultural dimensions and spiritual dimensions and all. But that was the way they framed it.
Yeah.
And when I went to Asia, of course, Asia for a Westerner is overwhelming in another way. You go to China or Hong Kong at that time. I also went to China, but Korea, India. Mm-hmm. These are very different places than Latin America or Africa. And of course, Africa has its own thing in Latin America. So, but now I would say, in what I hear from Asian theologians, and even in the 1988 Festschrift for Gustavo, there are heavy political elements in them, and they're, in a sense, fighting against this sense that Asia is this cultural icon that can't be moved. So, but again, I don't know, now that everyone's familiar, in the beginning, even in the 1980s, through Orbis Books in English, and in the 88 summer session, these theologies from Latin America, Africa, and Asia were connecting and seeing similarities and differences. But before that, or in the middle of that, there was this distinction: Latin America, Africa, Asia. And maybe those distinctions were important to keep to some level, and also to break. But what happens when, through English, everyone can communicate? Mm-hmm. What happens when they begin to see their similarities, and then you think, well, it's a global uprising? Mm-hmm. Well, maybe not. Again, the particularity diminishes, the universality increases, which is, of course, very Christian, the idea of universality. Mm-hmm. But who disappears in that universality, and who appears? You can say that about particularity too, who appears and disappears. Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and I was deeply involved in it. And when I went to different mission sites in these continents, you could feel the difference. And talking with Samuel Ryan from India and others, and from Pakistan, and traveling there and speaking there, you felt differences and similarities.
Yeah, it's interesting because even if how they name their theologies, Black liberation theology would be about black power, and the Latin American theology of liberation would have the violence of love. But with Asians, it's water buffalo or rice theology.
Yeah. Well, that was yes. Yeah, and you would be interested to know that the people who attended the '88 session were very taken with these different aspects, and the American group loved parts of the Asian because, well, it was really for them, well, a kind of Orientalism. And I think some of the Asian theologians of that time may have participated in that. And then, of course, we have those who are really now breaking through that. But many of them are in America. And maybe the ones that at least I know of that are breaking through these stereotypes are Asian Americans. So they're out of Asia. So that's another dimension about theologians from Latin America, Africa, and Asia settling in the United States, or like South Africa. Half of the people I knew from South Africa who fought in the struggle against apartheid in terms of the academy no longer live in South Africa. They're in America, in American universities. And what happens to them there? They become known for their theology and respected as part of the diversity of the world, but their particularity is formed more and more outside the place from which they come and for whom they speak. This is not talked about much or ever in my hearing about the movement of theologians from around the world to the center of American empire. And for some, they say, well, we deserve wherever we are. Well, okay, fine. I mean, it enriches American education.
It is also safe to criticize the empire when you're within the empire.
It's also a brain drain, a theological brain drain. But then many of these theologians couldn't survive thinking in certain ways in their countries. So then you have this understanding of diaspora. But what does that mean when their children are raised here, and what does diaspora really mean today when you can travel back and forth? That's another question, which was far from our minds in 1988, but 50 years later is crucial, that many of the fundamental questions, not all, for Africa, Asia, and Latin America are spoken and worked out outside of their own countries. This is very, very significant in my view, and maybe there is writing about it, which I haven't seen, or speech about it. It's enriched the American theological system big time. But what does it do in terms of the connections that these theologians have? Just traveling back for a seminar, enjoying the return and the adulation of being in America and succeeding in America. In terms of liberation theology, what does that mean for the people left behind?
From below.
Well, from below, and that's crucial. But
So,
it needs to be thought about, and I'm not sure that it's gaining enough thought.
If you look at it, Maryknoll has been very instrumental in globalizing liberation theology and using English as a medium. So that was the good thing that happened, that liberation theology became globalized. But at the same time, what I'm hearing from you is there's also another side of it that is diminished because of it has been globalized.
Oh, sure. Well, it's like global trade. I mean, there's a link between the globalization of economic life and the globalization of theology. And the idea was the globalization of theology would be able to interfere and maybe stop the unjust part of global trade. It hasn't. What you have are global theologians and global trade, just using the trade. And the poor remain, and perhaps grow. And the speech that we have to confront the globalization of everything is heightened because it can be heard in different places, and maybe diminished because it is global. And of course, this is a Christian undertaking by and large. There's of course a Jewish theology of liberation and Islamic variants too. And but to me, it doesn't lead to where we need to go. Would the other, keeping them separate, keeping them distinct, keeping them particular, would that have led any place? That's another question. So, global theology is a Christian iteration of universalism. And as a Jew looking at it, I wonder about universalism. Now, in Jewish life, there is a universalism that comes from particularity, and you could argue that Latin American particularity, of course, you have a lot of particularities within Latin America, and Africa, and Asia. I mean, we begin to lump the Asian, African, you're Latin American, or you're Latinx. And what does that ultimately mean? And it may be that you have to, in a globalized world, you have to globalize identities too. But as far as I've experienced it, Korean is different than Japanese, which is different than Chinese, which is different than Filipino. Not completely different and not completely the same. When you homogenize them in a universality, including in theology, what do you get? Now, if you keep them particular, you think by universalizing, you have more power, you have more voices, you have more people, you have more stuff. That may be true. But I don't know that it's true.